The year was 1974. America stood at a crossroads. Its currency, once anchored to gold, now floated on trust, and that trust was cracking. Just 3 years earlier, President Richard Nixon had closed the gold window. For the first time in modern history, US dollars could no longer be exchanged for gold. It was meant to be temporary, it became permanent. The dollar was now a promise without a foundation. The world panicked. Foreign governments dumped dollars. Inflation surged. The very idea of a reserve currency seemed ready to collapse. Then oil changed everything. The 1973 oil crisis hit like a sledgehammer. Arab producers, furious over Western support in the Yom Kippur War, cut supply. Prices quadrupled. Gas lines stretched for miles. But in the chaos, Washington saw opportunity. American officials met quietly with Saudi Arabia and struck a deal that would rewrite global finance. The Saudis would sell their oil only in US dollars, and America would guarantee their security. Soon after, OPEC followed. From that moment, every nation that needed oil also needed dollars. Demand for energy became demand for America's money. The dollar, once backed by gold, was now backed by oil, and by force. A new order had begun. Not Bretton Woods, but Petrodollar Woods. Now the United States could spend without fear. It could print what the world had to earn. Deficits became strategy. Debt became strength. The petrodollar was more than a financial system. It was an empire, quiet, invisible, self-reinforcing. An empire built not only on armies, but on dependence. And as long as the world kept buying oil, it would keep believing in the dollar. But why would Saudi Arabia agree to tie its future to America's money? To see it clearly, you have to look through Riyadh's eyes in 1974. The Arab world had just discovered its true leverage, oil. For decades, Western companies had taken the profits while local nations watched. The 1973 embargo proved a lesson no one forgot. A few oil states could bring the industrial world to its knees, but leverage without protection is fragile. Saudi Arabia was rich in oil but surrounded by instability, revolutions, rivalries, wars. They had money underground, but not the military to defend it. America had the opposite problem. It had power, but no longer had gold. Its currency was bleeding trust, its prestige under pressure. It needed something real to anchor the dollar again, something the world could not live without. Oil became that anchor, so the two sides made a deal built on survival. The Saudis would price every barrel in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide weapons, training, and an iron guarantee of security. If the kingdom was threatened, America would protect it. Those meetings, led by U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon and Saudi officials, were kept quiet, but their impact was seismic. Soon other OPEC members followed. Every barrel of oil sold was now bought with US dollars and stored in Western banks. That money didn't just sit idle. It flowed back into American bonds, stocks, and treasuries. Oil sales generated dollars. Those dollars funded US debt, and US debt financed the military that protected the oil routes. Round and round it went, a self-feeding loop of energy and influence. For America, it was alchemy, a way to turn paper into power. For Saudi Arabia, it was insurance, a shield for its crown and its oil fields. The petrodollar was born not out of friendship, but out of necessity. Two nations, each with what the other lacked, binding their fates together. It worked beautifully until the world began to change. The petrodollar system did more than stabilize the U.S. economy. It rewired the planet. Every nation that wanted oil now needed dollars. To get dollars, they had to export goods, borrow from American banks, or buy U.S. debt. The dollar became the circulatory system of global trade, and Washington sat at the heart of it. If you were a developing nation in the 1980s and needed energy, you couldn't simply pay in your own currency. You had to earn or borrow US dollars first, and those loans came with conditions: trade reforms, austerity, and alignment with Western interests. Debt was no longer a burden for America. It was a weapon. The US could run deficits without fear because the world had to hold its debt just to buy fuel. In effect, the rest of the world paid a tax to America every time they filled a tank. And as those petrodollars flowed back to Wall Street, they funded military bases, wars, and consumer booms at home. A family in Kansas could buy cheap gas because a factory in India had to earn dollars first. An American soldier in the Gulf was protecting the same routes that kept American credit alive. It was a perfect circle of modern empire. Money, energy, and military power feeding each other in endless rotation. But no empire lasts forever. By the 2000s, new currencies were rising. China's industrial surge and Russia's oil wealth challenged America's grip. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan strained trust in the system. And then came sanctions. The moment Washington turned its own currency into a political weapon. When the U.S. froze foreign reserves of nations it disagreed with, it sent a signal to the world. The dollar was no longer neutral. It was power with conditions. That was the beginning of the end, because the one thing more valuable than money is trust. And once trust breaks, even an empire of paper can burn. For nearly 50 years, the petrodollar ruled unchallenged. Every barrel of oil sold meant fresh demand for U.S. money, and that money flowed back to finance American debt, American wars, American dreams. It was a cycle so vast that most people never noticed it. Like air, invisible but everywhere. But power built on habit is power that can be lost. By the 2010s, the balance began to shift. China had risen from factory floor to world workshop. Its hunger for oil was enormous, but Beijing disliked paying in dollars. Every shipment meant dependence on a rival's currency, exposure to a rival's sanctions, vulnerability to a rival's banks. And then came the sanctions. When the United States froze billions in foreign reserves, first from Iran, later from Russia, it revealed the petrodollar's dark side. The world saw that the dollar was no longer merely a medium of exchange. It was a weapon that could be turned off with a keystroke. That realization sent quiet shockwaves through capitals from Riyadh to Beijing. China responded the way empires in waiting always do, by building an alternative. It signed long-term energy deals with Russia, Iran, and the Gulf, some settled in yuan. It launched its own global payments network to rival SWIFT. It opened oil futures markets denominated in Chinese currency. Slowly, trade routes once paved with dollars began to shimmer with hints of something new. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, joined the conversation. Together, they represented nearly half the world's population and a growing share of its oil demand. They began talking openly about a shared payment system, even a common reserve currency backed not by politics, but by commodities. Gold, oil, copper, grain. Real things instead of promises. For now, the dollar still dominates. Most global trade, most debt, most reserves remain tied to it. But history doesn't turn all at once. It tilts. And the tilt has begun. Saudi Arabia itself, once the cornerstone of the petrodollar deal, is hedging its bets. It trades oil with China in yuan, signs defense pacts beyond Washington's orbit, and joins BRICS summits once considered unthinkable. The alliance that once seemed eternal now shows its age. The cracks are not explosions, they're vibrations. Each new deal outside the dollar is a tremor under the empire's foundation. And just like Rome before it, America faces the same dilemma: how to maintain confidence in a system the world is slowly learning to live without. The petrodollar's strength was never oil alone. It was belief. Belief that the dollar would always be safe, always be accepted, always be king. But belief, once questioned, is belief already half gone. Every empire ends the same way, not with conquest, but with confidence breaking. And for the petrodollar, that break has already begun. For half a century, the system looked invincible. Oil flowed, dollars cycled, and the world believed the arrangement would last forever. But beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was forming. One not fought with armies, but with algorithms and alternatives. Today, nations don't need to invade to resist the dollar. They just need to trade without it. Digital payment systems now bypass traditional banks. Central banks themselves are experimenting with new forms of currency: programmable, traceable, instantaneous. China's once digital yuan already processes oil trades. India, Russia, and the Gulf are building direct settlement lines that no longer pass through New York or London. Even allies are hedging, quietly diversifying their reserves away from U.S. treasuries. Every step chips away at the structure that once looked eternal. The irony is striking. When the gold standard collapsed, the dollar survived by anchoring itself to oil. Now, as energy systems evolve from fossil fuels to renewables, that same anchor is loosening. The world is still running on oil, but it's thinking in electrons. And a digital world doesn't need a single global middleman. Yet America's response feels eerily familiar. More debt, more printing, more promises. Each rescue disguised as reform. Each crisis met with a bigger balance sheet, the same pattern that toppled Rome's coinage, that hollowed out Weimar's mark, that froze Japan's growth, now written in the language of modern finance. The dollar still dominates. Yes, it still settles most trade. It still fills the vaults of central banks from Riyadh to Singapore. But the tone has changed. Where there was once faith, there is calculation. Where there was loyalty, there is strategy. And strategy, unlike belief, can shift overnight. The question is no longer if the petrodollar will fade, it's how quietly or how violently it will happen. If the transition is managed, the world may move toward a multipolar system, several reserve currencies balancing one another, each backed by regional power and resources. If it isn't, the adjustment could fracture markets, ignite inflation, and redraw alliances faster than any war could. Because when trust leaves a system built entirely on it, panic doesn't walk, it runs. For now, the United States remains the custodian of global money, but it's also its largest debtor. A nation that once owned 2/3 of the world's gold now owes more than 34 trillion. The world still accepts those debts, not because it must, but because it hasn't yet agreed on what comes next. And that is the true fragility of our age. A global economy waiting for the next standard, the next anchor, the next belief strong enough to replace the old one. When oil replaced gold, the world was forced into a new order overnight. What replaces oil may do the same. Not with barrels, but with bytes. The petrodollar's reign was built on energy, enforced by power, and sustained by trust. Now, each of those pillars trembles. The oil still burns, the ships still sail, but the money, the meaning of money, is already changing, and the next empire of currency may not be printed at all.